Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I really hope you're all well. Welcome back to another Bloodsucker book club video. Is that what I called this? I can't even remember what I called this now, but welcome back. Hi, how are you? I hope you're all really well. I'm about to fall off the edge of my bed, so I'm just going to rectify that. I am going to do a book review video for you today. Before I get stuck in, it is going to be a spoiler-filled book review, so if you have not yet read the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires and you would like to read it, then I suggest you read it before you watch this video. But I will say, it was a 5-star read for me, so I do highly recommend it. And if you've stumbled upon this video to see if it's something that you would like, that is all I'm going to say to you at this point. 5 stars, loved it, highly recommend. I'm just going to get into the video. So, the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires is the second Grady Hendrix novel I've ever read. I first read the book he released, My Best Friend's Exorcism, forgot what it was called, which I also gave 5 stars to and absolutely loved, and I've subsequently reread a couple of times. I think the first time I read it was kind of Halloween time in 2017, and then I read it again Halloween 2018 and thoroughly loved it. Or maybe it was 2019, I don't know, it doesn't even matter, it's irrelevant, I loved it. So when I heard that he had released the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, obviously I wanted to pick it up and give it a go. As we established in my intro video to this series, I am trash for vampires, so obviously was going to pick this up. So this book centres around a group of housewives, Southern housewives in South Carolina in America, and particularly around Patricia Campbell, who is married to a workaholic. She has 2 children who are both going through very kind of difficult teenage years. She gave up her job as a nurse when she got married, and she's just kind of a bit lost, you know. She's kind of just a bit fed up with the drudgery of cooking and cleaning and looking after everybody every day, and she wants a bit of excitement in her life. So her husband suggests that she should join a book club. So Patricia joins this book club full of other Southern housewives, and basically they all sit and they all read from these prescribed lists of literature that's all very appropriate and very kind of well respected, and Patricia's not loving it. And then on one very memorable occasion, she is actually supposed to be hosting the book club that month, and she hasn't even bothered to read the book that she's supposed to be discussing, and it causes a massive argument at the book club, and a lot of the women walk out. And one of the women that walks out is Kitty, who decides to take Patricia under her wing and asks her to join her in reading some other fiction instead, and to kind of make their own book club. And Patricia's a little bit unsure to begin with. She doesn't know if she can really be bothered, but Kitty gives her this book anyway and says, read it, let me know what you think. And it turns out to be a true crime novel. Patricia surprises herself, devours it in 3 days, and obviously goes to the book club meeting, and from there on she becomes fast friends with a wonderful group of women. And I will get back onto that group of women in a minute, because honestly their relationship and their characters were just so fantastic throughout this novel, and I loved it so much. Anyway, after one of these book club sessions where they've been reading the true crime novels, she discovers that a new neighbour has moved to town. This guy called James Harris has moved to take care of his great aunt, who lives close to her, and he's not quite what he seems. And at first she feels a little bit sorry for him. She wants to kind of welcome him to the neighbourhood, and he begins to take advantage of her kindness a little bit, but her southern hospitality side just won't quite say no to him. She can't quite bring herself to say no, and she ends up kind of getting embroiled in all these things that she's not too comfortable with, but she kind of just pushes it under the rug. She's like, you know what, it'll be fine, it'll be fine. Things are actually not fine. It very much turns out that James Harris is not who he says he is, and Patricia begins to get a little bit suspicious. So she starts to raise her suspicions to the other housewives within the book club, and they end up investigating James Harris and the crimes that he is committing. So that is kind of a spoiler-free version of the book. Obviously, when you read the blurb of the book, you kind of already know that James is going to be the vampire. And I think it's very important to say that when you go into this book, it is quite predictable, but I think it was written with the intention of being predictable. This book isn't about discovering who the vampire is. This book is not about discovering necessarily who's committing the crimes and everything else. This book, you already know it's going to be James. You know he's the vampire. This book is actually more about Patricia's journey to finding that, and kind of the woman that she becomes along the way, and the journeys all of her friends also take with her. So as you can see, I have tabbed this book quite a lot. This was actually my first time tabbing a book, which you will know if you've read my reading vlog, which I will leave above, some real-time reactions to things that happen within this book. And I've also kind of written post-it notes throughout as well, not that you can see any of them on any of the pages that I'm trying to show you, but I've written post-it notes throughout just to kind of illustrate my thoughts on some of the things that happen within the book. But as you can see from the front, I have my notes for the review, so I'm actually going to just keep referring to those as the book goes on. So, first of all, I will say there should definitely be some trigger warnings for this book. In my opinion, there should be trigger warnings for sexual assault, rape, self-harm, suicide, abuse, domestic abuse, racism. I think that's all I can think of off the top of my head. And I think this book's come under fire a little bit on Goodreads, as I've seen today, from people getting angry at the representation of women and the representation of people of colour within the book. And I think Grady Hendrix has done this on purpose. I don't think he's written this from a position of trying to marginalise both those groups. I think he is trying to give an accurate impression, A, of what life would have been like in South Carolina in the 80s and 90s, but also to make you angry as a reader at the injustices that those groups are shown. In this book, women are very much gaslighted. There's a lot of sexism, there's a lot of talking down to women, there's a lot of, oh, but you're just a silly housewife, what do you know? And that, as a reader, should make you angry at the injustice. Likewise, unfortunately, within this book, and I think this is hitting harder at the time of reading because of what is going on currently with the Black Lives Matter movement as well, I definitely think I've taken this on board a lot more than perhaps I would have done before recent events in the news. It's kind of really thrown to light still the stark differences between how white people and black people live in certain parts of America, and the white people in this book are kind of the upper class in society. They're living in the big houses, they're all, you know, air conditioned, wealthy, and everything's fluffy and happy and wonderful. And then you go to a different part of their neighbourhood and the black people are living in trailers and they're living in poverty, and they're the ones who are being exposed to the evil within this book. It's their children that are going missing, it's their children that are getting attacked, it's them who are still in jobs of a service nature, waitresses, you know, bartenders, cleaners. And I think you are supposed to get angry at that injustice, and I think you are supposed to see the stark differences between black and white in society still. And it's not right at all, and it made me so angry to read it. And I think that's been done so well in this book, and I think, yeah, you have to go into it knowing those things, because I think otherwise, I don't know, maybe you would have a negative reading experience. But I mean, certainly my friend Alex is reading this at the same time as me, and she's very triggered, I think, by kind of discussions of sexism and that kind of thing. She always has been, so I know she's finding those chapters particularly difficult to read. And I think, yeah, I think you need to go into it with the mindset of, it's laid out, it's supposed to be written in that way. It's not written to marginalise those groups further. It's supposed to illustrate how those groups are already represented in society. So, first of all, things that I loved about this book. I've got to talk about the characters. I've just got to. So the main character, people say the main protagonist is James, but I'd say the main protagonist is actually Patricia. And I think Patricia's character arc is wonderful throughout this book. At the beginning, she's quite a downtrodden housewife. She's doing what she thinks she should do. She's living up to this Southern hospitality mindset that her mum brought her up with. You know, she's doing what her husband wants. Everything is about looking after her husband and the kids, keeping the house clean, and keeping up this respectable visage for the neighbours and for other people in society. But it's quite interesting to see how much she changes throughout the book, and she goes from being this kind of like downtrodden housewife character to kind of completely shedding that and realising who she wants to be, and realising that actually she's strong and she's a badass and she doesn't need to conform to society's ideas of what she should be. Yes, she can be a Southern housewife, but she can also be a Southern housewife with her own opinions, with her own job, who can stand up to her husband, who can stand up to the people around her who are treating her badly. And I love that kind of realization that actually she is so strong and she is so capable, and she can totally foil this whole crime plot, whatever. She can totally identify the vampire, she can totally kill the vampire, you know. She sacrifices herself for her friends, for her family, in order to get rid of this danger. And I think that she's strong. She's such a fucking badass. I love that. And I also love the other women as well. I love kind of how their friendship and how their relationship tightens as the book goes on, and how each of them has their own kind of individual little mini character arcs in terms of like learning to stand up to their husbands, learning to kind of stand up for what they believe in, learning to say no to each other. I think the other character who really intrigued me the most from the women in this book is Grace. I think at the beginning you expect her to be so straight-laced and so kind of stereotypical, and yet she comes out with some of the funniest lines in the entire book. And I think towards the end, again, where she is able to shed her kind of preconceived ideas of who she should be and how she should behave to become this kind of badass woman who essentially ends up saving the day and uses her knowledge that she's gathered by cleaning up after her husband and her kids all her life to be able to clean up a freaking crime scene and organise how to dispose of a body. Like, I love that. She's such a badass as well. You also have to mention Mrs. Green in here as well. She is a wonderful, wonderful character. I just absolutely adored her with every bone in my body. I loved how caring she was, how nurturing she was, and how willing she was to continue to help these women despite the fact that they'd let her down previously. And yeah, their characters were wonderful. I think each of the women was really well fleshed out, and I think the character development was brilliant. I do actually think that the character development for James the vampire was actually not as good. I feel like perhaps we could have learned a little bit more about him in terms of his past. Like there was little tidbits dropped from the very beginning of the book the whole way through, which definitely I think you were supposed to realise at the beginning that Miss Mary had realised that Hoyt Pickens was James Harris, and I think you were supposed to realise that, you know, he obviously had been alive for many years and everything else. But I think that yeah, I think his character could have been fleshed out a little bit more, because at the end of the day we didn't know much about James ultimately, and I think maybe that was intentional. Maybe we weren't supposed to, maybe he was still supposed to be an enigma by the time the book ended, but I would have liked to have seen and learned a little bit more about him and kind of how vampires are in this book, because they are so different in this book to how they are in many other books that I've read, but I will get onto that again in a little while. I also really love the setting of this book. I am reading an increasingly large number of books at the moment that are set in America's Deep South, and I just find it quite fascinating, again because of current events, learning about life and how it has been in the southern states historically and to this day. I think, I don't know, it's such a cultural shift from where I am in the UK in many respects, so I do find it really fascinating, and I love America as a place as well. So kind of any book set in the South right now is definitely capturing my imagination and capturing my heart a little bit more, so I've thoroughly enjoyed the setting of this book. Also, another thing I love, the humour. It's funny, it's so funny. So the blue tabs are for things that I've found amusing, and for the entire start of the book pretty much I was tabbing everything blue. Obviously as we got more towards kind of the main key plot points, the amusing side, the tongue-in-cheek side kind of takes a bit of a backseat, but I mean the first and the last tab that I put in this book were for things that I found amusing. So yeah, I think Grady Hendrix has a great way of being able to write horror and to be able to write gore and be able to write suspense, but then still throw in some amazing one-liners and things that just make you like snort with laughter. So that was brilliant. On to things that I found a little bit different and a little bit perhaps uncomfortable as a reader. So I don't think there was anything in this book that I particularly disliked. I mean, I didn't like the representation of women obviously, and I didn't like the representation of race, but I knew that that had been done on purpose and you were supposed to feel uncomfortable about that. So I'm not going to say those things I didn't like. I'm going to say those are things that made me uncomfortable, or things that I wasn't like as much of a fan of because I was supposed to not be a fan of them, if that makes sense. One thing I don't like is the fact that Grady Hendrix always tugs on your heartstrings as a reader by making something happen to the dog. I absolutely hate that. He did it with My Best Friend's Exorcism, and he's done it again with this book. I'm glad that what happened to Ragtag happened at the very end of the book, and I'm glad that it was a natural thing and not at the hands of a vampire, but it was still to me a little bit unnecessary. It did make me cry, and I don't like bad things happening to dogs, so that was sad. I will admit, I didn't like that. It did make me a little bit upset. There was also a quote at the very beginning of the book that I really hated and immediately tabbed purple, which was, so it's actually the dictionary definition of a housewife from 1971, a light, worthless woman or girl. Thanks for that. Love that. Love that for us. Not that I'm a housewife, but just a woman in general, you know. Anyway, so I didn't like that. I did not like that. However, there are some themes in this book that I found pretty interesting. So the first thing that I have to say is how different this is from any vampire fiction that I have read before. So ordinarily the vampire fiction that I've read in the past has been kind of teen vampire fiction, so things along the lines of Twilight or Vampire Academy, where the vampires were kind of painted in both kind of like a intimidating and negative light, but also in like a positive light, like you're supposed to fall in love with one of them, and you know, I'm thinking sparkly vampires, and you're very drawn to them, and they're always good looking, and they're always wanting to, I don't know, like suck on your blood and with the fangs and everything. But this is not what this vampire's like. Grady Hendrix has managed to somehow take a classic fictional trope, a classic mythological creature, and give it a whole fresh perspective, and what he's come up with is something completely alien, and I find that really interesting. There's no fangs, there's no sucking blood from your neck in this book. It actually becomes a little bit more sexual and a lot more disturbing, and I definitely find that more horrifying as a reader, to be honest. You know, I've read spooky vampire books in the past where even with the traditional fangs and neck biting has kind of set you on edge a little bit, but this made me feel truly uncomfortable in places. And I'll get on to kind of the sexual themes in a minute, but I think just the fact that it was so different from what we've normally read when it comes to vampire fiction, wow, that's bright, I'm so sorry, the sun is like, if I hold the book there, maybe that'll help. Yeah, stepping away from your comfort zone with vampire literature, I don't know, it did definitely just made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. I enjoyed feeling uncomfortable because that is what I've come to know and expect from Grady Hendrix's books. But yeah, I definitely felt very uncomfortable reading this in many, many parts, mostly because of the sexual themes, which again I will get on to in a moment. But I did enjoy the fact that vampires were represented very differently to how they normally are. I think it was a very refreshing take. It was nice to read something so different, and kind of the alien aspect. Yeah, it was nice to just be made to feel a little bit uncomfortable. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, the only other book by Grady Hendrix I have read is My Best Friend's Exorcism, and within that book, towards the end of it, you're kind of left wondering if the events that happen within that book actually did happen, or if it is just something that has been blown out of proportion in the girl's imagination. And that's never really cleared up. I think it's very much left to the reader to make their own decision on that one. I personally, after reading that book, thought that the girls kind of had an overactive imagination and none of what they actually thought was happening had happened. And I kind of thought for a little while that that was going to be the case with this book as well, because of the sexual themes that I have been talking about. So obviously if you've read the book, you'll already know that rather than using fangs to bite his victims' necks, James has this weird appendage that comes out of his throat that burrows into basically the crease of skin between a woman's vagina and her thigh. And so when he's feeding on his victims, it essentially looks to the unassuming eye as if he's performing oral sex, I guess. And most of the victims he chooses are children. And that, to me, really made me uncomfortable, and I think that would make any reader uncomfortable. Preying on children anyway as a vampire is disgusting, but when it has that kind of sexual undertone, it's perverted, and I think I said that within my reading vlog. Again, I know that it was done deliberately to make you feel maximum discomfort, and fair play to Grady Hendrix, because I felt maximum discomfort reading that. There were many scenes that made me feel, yeah, especially because he describes when Patricia gets fed on, it's described as like the most incredible and intense sexual feeling. So to me, I don't know, like that really didn't sit well with me when I thought about the fact that obviously children had been fed on in the same way. Like really did not like that at all. So those sexual themes definitely disturbed me a lot, and I did wonder while reading this for a while whether the vampire was supposed to be a metaphor for just a sexual predator, and whether what they were actually going to uncover was not actually a vampire but just somebody who was abusing children, which is equally as horrifying. I say just somebody abusing children, but okay, I'm not articulating myself how I wish in this video. But yeah, I did wonder for a while if it was going to be a metaphor for sexual abuse in children. And I think maybe it kind of was a little bit, but ultimately by the end of the book, yes, he was a vampire, and these women all agreed that he was a vampire, and yeah, it was a vampire story. It wasn't just a story about sexual abuse. I think those themes were interesting though. Yeah, maximum discomfort whilst reading them. I didn't enjoy them. I didn't, but I enjoyed the book as a whole and understood why Grady Hendrix had made you feel as uncomfortable as you did while reading. It was a very interesting concept. I can't say that I ever want to read a book again about vampires that has the same kind of feeding method. There's also a scene in which he decides to make Slick a vampire, and we don't know that that's what he's done until the very end of the book, where he basically tells you that that is what he's done. But the way he makes Slick a vampire is basically by raping her, and again, like, I just find that unnecessary. That made me uncomfortable, but what can I say? So I'm going to end this video on a positive note, because I did forget to mention at the beginning when talking about characters that one of the things I love the most about this book is not that these women were kind of badass female characters who've saved the day and everything else. It's the fact that actually they're just normal women who banded together to overthrow evil. And I think that made it so much more believable and so much more relatable that these women were not supposed to be amazing, strong women from the beginning. These are people who have actually stood up for themselves, stood up against society's expectations, stood up against their husbands, pushed aside the abuse, pushed aside the gaslighting and the sexism to band together to make a change. And I think that in itself was kind of the overarching storyline for me, and I really, really loved that. And I think if you take anything from this novel, it should be that. You know, the power of female friendships and the power of just like regular women, just regular normal women, not women who are already supposed to be like a badass. I'm thinking of my kind of favourite female protagonist, who is obviously Selena Sardothien, or Aelin, I forgot her name then. Aelin from the Throne of Glass series, and she is already a badass. You know, you read the first Throne of Glass novel and she's overthrown half of Vendovia already in the salt mines, and she's, you know, she's this badass. She knows how to fight, she knows how to kill people, she's not scared of anything. And while that's amazing and it's so good to read like a strong female character, it's not always as believable. Whereas these women, they're not like that already. You know, they rise up, they fight against the patriarchy, and they really do make a difference, even if it is just in their small community. And I think that is the thing that you should take away from this book more than anything else. But I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I read it within about 48 hours. I absolutely devoured it. I definitely would read it again. I highly recommend it. I gave it 5 stars. It was wonderful. Definitely one of the most surprising, I mean, I'm going to say the most surprising read of this year. It's not really in the sense that I kind of thought already that I would enjoy it, but I didn't expect it to be the way it was, if that makes sense. And I think for that reason alone, it is definitely one of my most surprising books of the year. But I thoroughly loved it. I will recommend it to everybody. I'm so glad this was the first book that I decided to start this vampire series with, because it's definitely got off to a bang, and I can't wait to read more. I kind of also want to go back and read more of Grady Hendrix's previous work as well, because he's got 3 novels out that I haven't read before. So yes, I definitely want to go back and reread them, or read them, sorry. But yeah, I highly recommend it. Definitely think you should pick it up. If you have read it already, let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know if you agree with any of my perceptions. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. Please hit the subscribe button. I'll be back with another one very soon. Bye guys.